Welcome to the course on medical law. This lecture will be about comparative law on organ transplantation. The concepts covered in this lecture are overview of legal framework on organ transplantation, the legal position in US, legal position in UK, Indian law on organ transplantation and comparative analysis. The keywords of this lecture are organ tourism, organ donation, organ transplantation, organ trafficking and regulatory law. Organ transplantation is referred to as the transfer or engraftment of human cells, tissues or organs from a donor to a recipient to restore functions in the body. It is considered as a medical miracle of the 20th century and it has evolved over years to be a viable treatment option for those affected due to organ failures. So, advancements in the field of science and technology, including medical science, has led to a situation where now it is possible for medical experts to transplant human organs. So, this has given a ray of hope for patients who are affected with terminal illness due to organ failures. So, for patients who are affected with organ failures, now there is a possibility of transplanting their organs from another human being. For a long time, there was no legal framework to effectively regulate organ transplantation and prevent commercial transactions. So, for a long period of time, there was no adequate legal framework to effectively regulate organ transplantation which is happening in the country. So, this has led to a scenario that there were commercial transactions happening in order to facilitate organ transplantations. So, donors were identified after payment of substantial amount and organ harvesting was also happening, which are unethical and illegal practice. The need for a comprehensive legal framework was felt due to the increase in the unethical practices and the proliferation of organ trade. Organ donation is defined as the act of giving one or more organs without compensation for transplantation into human body. So, what is generally encouraged is organ donations. So, a human being willingly donates his organs to another person for transplantation and there is no monetary consideration involved in such transactions. So, it is possible that some of the organs can be taken from a live donor. One of the example is kidney. Similar to that, many other organs can be taken only from patients who are brain dead. So, a live donor can give a consent that in case of any unexpected scenario, organs from his body could be used for transplanting into a patient. So, because of this, there are generally two types of organ donations. One is deceased donation and second one is living donation. This means that living donation means that the donated organs come from either a living donor. Deceased donation means that organs are coming from a donor who is either brain dead or is identified with circulatory death. The objective of organ donation is to enhance or save the life of a person who receives the transplanted organ. Organ transplantation is often the only treatment for end stage organ failure such as liver and heart failure. We will regulate organ transplantation in order to curb unethical and illegal practices happening in the medical profession. Now, let us have a look at the various international instruments which governs organ transplantation. First one is Council of Europe Convention against trafficking in human organs. The convention was adopted in 2015 by the Council of Europe. The convention seeks to prevent and fight trafficking of human organs by providing for criminalization of certain acts. It also protects rights of victims and facilitates cooperation at domestic and international level on action against trafficking of human organs. This is a convention which was adopted by the Council of Europe. So, it is applicable only to European countries who are part of the Council of Europe, and recently Israel has also become part of the Convention against Trafficking in Human Organs. It facilitates cooperation at domestic and international level in order to prevent trafficking of human organs. It also requires the member countries to criminalize certain offences like trafficking of human organs, organ harvesting, taking of human organs without consent, and many other things. The convention calls upon each party to take necessary measures, including legislative and regulatory measures, to establish illegal removal of organs from live or deceased donors as a criminal offence in the domestic law. So, all the member countries to this convention has an obligation to criminalize organ transplantation without consent. This also provides to establish criminal offences to cover all parties of human organ trafficking, including those who solicit and those who recruit the donors. The convention thus proposes to criminalize the use of illegally removed organs, illegal solicitation, recruitment of organ donors and recipients for any financial gain. Now, let us look at the Declaration of Istanbul. The Declaration of Istanbul was created at the Istanbul Summit on Organ Trafficking and Transplant Tourism, which was held in 2008 in Istanbul in Turkey. It addresses the issues of transplant tourism, trafficking and commercialism, and provides etiquette guidelines for practicing organ donation and transplantation. Since the creation of the declaration, more than 100 countries have endorsed the principles of the declaration. Some nations have subsequently strengthened their national laws against commercial organ trade. The declaration is at present endorsed by more than 135 national and international medical societies and governmental bodies who are involved in regulating organ transplantation. The Declaration of Istanbul was the first concerted effort to mobilize professionals involved in organ transplantation so as to develop practical and ethically acceptable solutions to the problem of international trafficking of human organs. The declaration sought to prohibit transplant commercialism, transplant tourism and organ trafficking. So, even though there were several initiatives happening at the governmental level, Istanbul Declaration's relevance is that it was the first concerted effort at the international level to mobilize professionals who are involved in organ transplantation. The Istanbul Declaration tries to provide safe, effective and accountable practice addressing the issues and needs of organ recipients and live organ donors. One of the major objectives of the declaration is to maximize the benefits from the organ transplantation and share them equitably with the people in need. As per the principles of the Istanbul Declaration, trafficking in human organs and trafficking in persons for organ removal should be prohibited and be considered as a criminal offence. It also states that organ transplantation should be a commercially neutral act. So, this means that there should not be any financial motivations involved in organ transplantation. So, donors or recipients should not be solicited on the basis of financial incentives. The declaration also put forward various proposals to increase donor pool and prevent organ trafficking. The declaration specifically addressed measures which are required to prevent commercialization of transplants, transplant tourism, and also to encourage legitimate life-saving transplantation programs. The World Health Organization has also come out with guiding principles on human cell, tissue and organ transplantation. The WHO guiding principles was endorsed in May 2010 by the 63rd World Health Assembly resolution and updated considering the changes in practices and perspectives with respect to organ and tissue transplantation. The guiding principles intends to provide an orderly, ethical and acceptable framework for the procurement and transplantation of human cells, tissues and organs for therapeutic purposes. The principles emphasize the significance of ensuring proper documentation, enhancing transparency for quality management and justify the confidence of patients, clinicians and community at large in donation and transplantation services. The guiding principles thus reiterates the need to follow an ethical, acceptable legal framework for human organ transplantation. The most important provision of the guiding principle is 5, which intend to avoid payments for organs as it is likely to take unfair advantage of the poorest and most vulnerable section of the society. There are also provisions which prohibit advertisements for inviting donors with an aim to involve commercial dealings. So, there are provisions in the guiding principle which specifically avoid payments for organ transplantation and also prohibit advertisement inviting donors. It is also stated that allocation of organs must be as per clinical criteria and ethical norms and not financial or other considerations. So, financial or monetary considerations should not be considered at all while making a decision regarding organ transplantation. Donors should not be solicited by giving any financial or other incentives. The selection and allocation of organs must be solely based on clinical criteria and ethical norms. So, now let us have a comparative perspective of 3 different jurisdictions. Let us start from legal position in United States of America. In US, there are many legislations that address various aspects of organ transplantation and organ donation. These regulations covers various aspects of organ transplantation like determining what constitutes being dead, determining what constitutes the consent for organ donation and also conferring of national honors for organ donation. However, the main legislations that are associated with commercial dealings in human organs are the National Organ Transplant Act passed by the US Congress in 1984 and second is the Uniform Anatomical Gifts Act of 1968. Let us start with the National Organ Transplant Act of 1984. The National Organ Transplant Act was enacted to establish a task force on organ transplantation and to create a organ procurement and transplantation network. It is the cornerstone of federal organ donation and transplantation system. The Act specifically prohibits commercial dealings in human organs and any violation of the provisions of the Act will result in imprisonment and fine. The legislation calls for organ procurement and transplantation network to be created and run by a private non-profit organization under a federal contract. So, the legislation provides for creation of a national level network known as Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network. In 1986, the network was created with the aim to increase and ensure the effectiveness, efficacy and equity of organ sharing in the national system and increase the supply of donated organs available for transplantation. Now, let us look at another legislation, which is the Uniform Anatomical Gifts Act of 1968. So, prior to the previous legislation, the regulatory activity with respect to organ transplantation was primarily driven by Uniform Anatomical Gifts Act of 1968. This act provides for establishing a regulatory framework for donating tissues, organs and other human body parts in the country. The act regards donation of organs as an anatomical gift and should not be having any monetary consideration. So, the lacking of monetary consideration is vital in the context of this federal law, which prohibits any buying or selling of human organs. So, organ donation can happen only as an anatomical gift as provided in the Uniform Anatomical Gifts Act of 1968. Under the Act, an adult can make a gift either before the death, which is usually through a donor's registry, or the next of kin of the deceased can also authorize a gift at the time of the donor's death. So, donor registries were very successful in US for a long time. The law bars anyone, including the family, from revoking a consent which the deceased had given for organ transplantation, which is an anatomical gift, before his death. Now, let us look at the legal position in United Kingdom. UK enacted the Human Tissues Act in 1961, which shares resemblance with the Uniform Anatomical Gifts Act, which was introduced in US. The UK legislation created a system of express consent or voluntarism based on individual's right to determine for himself whether to donate his organs. So, it is completely the individual's consent as to whether to donate the organs or not. But the legislation faced criticism due to various ambiguities in the Act. One area of ambiguity concerns the sufficiency of donor cards, which was provided in the Act. The legislation also failed to define any authority that can indicate who constitutes the person lawfully in possession of a body. So, when the question arose as to what happens when a death occurs, there was no answer under the legislation. Who asks permission to harvest the organs, and from whom does that person seek the consent, were all unanswered questions under the legislation. Later, the UK Parliament replaced the legislation with the Human Tissue Act of 2004, which came into force in 2006. This new law allowed for anonymous organ donation. Now, let us have a look at the key features of the 2004 legislation. It establishes a human tissue authority to regulate activities concerning human tissue removal, storage, use and disposal. Make appropriate consent a legal requirement for removing, storing and using body parts, organs, tissues and cells. So, under the new legislation, appropriate consent is a legal requirement before removing any body part from a human body. The legislation also lists the purposes for which the consent is required. These are called as scheduled purposes under the legislation. It also sets out offences and penalties for breaching the requirements under the law. Under the 2004 legislation, there is an overarching principle that the consent must be given expressly and cannot be deemed to have been given in the absence of an objection. So, the legislation required that the consent given has to be an express consent. In the 2008, the Organ Donation Task Force came out with a report with 14 recommendations in order to address the barriers to organ donation. By that time, the law in Wales had already changed with the 2013 amendment, which introduced deemed consent. So, since then, there was a huge demand for opt-out system or deemed consent in United Kingdom. Thus, in 2019, Organ Donation Deemed Consent Act was enacted, which is also known as Max and Kira law. This law came into force in England in 2020 and it represents a shift towards opt-out or presumed consent system for organ donation. So, under this law, it is presumed that an individual has given consent for organ donation. So, if a person does not want to give consent, then he has to opt out of the system. The new Organ Donation Deemed Consent Act amends the 2004 legislation and bring an opt-out system, but it does not change any rule in consent to organ donation in respect of children under 18 years or people who have expressly made a decision on consent before their death. The Act also does not change the rules relating to donation by a living person. So, deemed consent will not apply to all organs and tissues. Organs and tissues that are excluded from deemed consent will be specified in the regulation issued by the Secretary of State. Now, let us come back to the legal position in India, which we have discussed in previous lectures. In India, the Transplantation of Human Organs Act 1994 regulates the removal, storage and transplantation of human organs for therapeutic purpose and it also prevents commercial dealings in human organs. The Act permits any person above 18 years to authorize voluntarily before his death the removal of any organ for therapeutic purpose. The analysis of Organ Transplantation Act has been covered in previous lectures. So, now let us compare all the three different legislations, the US legislation, UK legislation and the Indian legislation. In the US legislation, personal autonomy is given significant importance, while under the new system in UK, a soft opt-out system is introduced. In the US, opt-in system is followed, just like the system which is followed in India, where one have to expressly consent to organ donation before his death, or authorization can be given by next of kin in case of cadaver organ donation. On the other hand, UK has an opt-out system. Unlike India, in US, if an individual has registered to donate his organs in his lifetime, the permission is legally binding and has to be carried out at the time of organ donor's death, and his family does not have any right to override his decision of giving the consent. To conclude, the legislative and regulatory framework in India needs reforms to prevent commercial dealings in human organs or promote cadaver organ donations in the country. This needs to be done through appropriate amendments incorporating clear and more stringent provisions. Various administrative measures can also be adopted to ensure effective implementation of the legal framework. This can be done by bringing various amendments after having a comparative understanding of the workings of organ transplantation law in different countries. The references of this lecture can be seen here. Thank you very much for listening to this lecture. I hope you are enjoying the course.